This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Hello, and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm your host, Ahval editor David Lepeska, and with me today is Jalel Harchaoui, research fellow at the Clingendael Institute, a Dutch think tank. Hello, Jalel, and thanks for joining us.
Hello, David. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. We are talking on Tuesday, January 28th, a couple days after Turkish President Erdogan met with his Algerian counterpart in Algiers. Algerian newspapers have mostly hailed the meeting as a success, highlighting an emerging partnership between the two states while also acknowledging that they have their differences. An obvious example is the Libyan war, in which Turkey has been supporting the Tripoli-based government of national accord in its fight against General Khalifa Haftar, while Algeria has remained largely neutral and has seemed to be opposed to Turkey's intervention. Yet the two sides agreed to work together to push toward a permanent ceasefire and political solution. I wonder what you think. Is there room for a broader, deeper partnership between these two countries?
I think my job here is to kind of rain on the parade of all those official statements.
Please do.
Algeria is, first of all, is not opposed to the Turkish intervention specifically. It is opposed to all foreign interferences or all foreign interventions in Libya. And that subtlety is humongous, because if Algeria had said that it condemns only the Turkish part, then it would have found a much quicker and deeper agreement with Egypt. So there is an Algerian angle, and it has to be taken into consideration. But as I said, we should not exaggerate things. I think there is a tendency to forget two things about present-day Algeria. I remind your listeners that it's the beginning of a brand new presidency that will probably last several years,
right,
most likely.
And it's just been in office about a month, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, and it's the first time in 7 years that Algeria has a president that speaks and walks. So there's a lot of focus on trying to flirt with Algeria, seduce Algeria, and start on a positive note. And Algeria is very happy to be the object of so much attention, not because of geopolitical reasons. It's mostly because of its economic concerns. And those concerns supersede the Libya crisis or geopolitics in general. And when it looks at all those people so eager to visit Algiers, I would like to add that Abdullah bin Zayed, the foreign minister of the UAE, was intent actually on visiting Algiers less than 24 hours after President Erdogan. So that gives you an idea of how much pressure there is on Algeria. And when Algeria sees all of this, it thinks about capital. It thinks about money that could potentially be injected inside the country because it needs cash. And in that context, it's very much the what have you done for me lately, or more specifically, what can you do for me now? And in that regard, Turkey doesn't look very good. Turkey is a true economy, which is not the case for any other Middle East country, except perhaps Israel. It knows how to manufacture things, and it knows how to sell them. It's a very respectable economy, but at this juncture, it's in the grips of a very bad debt crisis, which cripples its economy. This concretely means that it cannot do much to seduce an entity like Algeria. It can talk about trade. It can say that it has every sincere intention to increase its investment by maybe 1 or 1.5 billion. But others can do better right now. And Algeria knows about this. So what I'm saying here is that a lot of the attention that is being paid to Algeria is obviously related to the Libya crisis, which is a very acute and intense crisis. It's recognized now as an important one. But Algeria keeps thinking about possible ways of actually using its attitude towards Libya as a currency to negotiate something that is much more important for it, which is money and economic considerations in general. And yes, Turkey is an economic power that should be respected, but not right now. Now is not a fantastic time to shine on that level.
It's interesting that you say that. I've read that Algeria's increased border security as a result of the Libyan war is costing some 500 million a year, which suggests that it will now increase with the renewed fighting and Turkish deployment. So it would seem like Algeria's new president has good reason to disagree with Erdogan, but yet they seem to get along quite well.
Yeah, this is because Algeria doesn't think that all the bad things that are happening in Tripoli are because of Turkey. So there's one very important nuance that I would like to highlight and underscore is the fact that the reason Algeria is indeed deeply worried about the Tripoli battle or the Tripoli war is not, in its perception, completely attributable to Turkey. Algeria, unlike France or other countries that are remote, knows full well what has happened over the last 9 to 10 months. Which is the fact that an offensive was launched by entities that have nothing to do with Turkey. In fact, it's the enemies of Turkey that decided that it was a good idea to launch an offensive, and when that offensive turned out to not be successful, they escalated and involved more destruction, more mayhem, more displacement, all the things that Algeria hates. So when you sit in Algiers, you don't ever think that the Tripoli battle is because of Turkey. Within that local framework, if you will, Turkey is not a good guy, but let's say it's certainly not the biggest, baddest person in terms of foreign interference in that area. Algeria knows full well that it's the UAE because it's a local actor and it cannot be fooled. It has to care about the details and it knows the sequence of events and it knows who's who.
Okay, before we get to Libya, I'd like to ask a little about Turkey's broader vision in Africa. Under Erdogan and his Justice and Development Party, or AKP, there's been a greater commitment to Africa, particularly increased trade and the delivery of aid and financial support to Muslim majority states in the Maghreb and Horn of Africa. In fact, it might surprise some people to learn that despite considerable tensions between Ankara and Cairo, Egypt is Turkey's largest trade partner in Africa, welcoming some 3 billion in Turkish goods in 2018. As Erdogan visits Gambia and Senegal in the coming days, I wonder how you view Turkey's Africa policy and the extent to which it's succeeding.
As I said earlier, I think it's taken seriously as a true economy that's truly capable of exporting manufactured goods, and those goods are more addictive, if you will, than other origins in terms of the countries exporting them, because they're cheaper. The Turkish traders are more willing to spend time in the local country. They understand the local markets. They are more effective, more willing to follow up on potential contracts and so on and so forth. So they are liked. And in general, in a country like Algeria, it's not seen as a big political danger because although everybody is aware of the preference of Ankara for political Islam right now in Algeria is not seen as the number one problem, politically speaking. Hirak, which is the revolt movement or the protest movement, I should say, that has been very vocal and very effective to some extent over the last 10 months, is not driven by political Islam at all. In fact, within the current atmosphere in Algiers, political Islam is seen as pro-state and pro-army even. So it sounds counterintuitive, but you have to kind of look at the features, the unique features of Algeria. We're not in a situation where political Islam is the boogeyman. So Erdogan is, of course, there's always a fear that he could somehow trigger a wave of Islamic populism. And that kind of current is certainly feared by the establishment or the deep state, if you will. I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theory person, but you do have deep ranks in the security and political establishment in Algiers, and they don't like the ideology of President Erdogan, but it's not the number one concern right now.
But it sounds like also not just speaking of Algeria, but more broadly in Africa, you're saying that the connections to Turkey don't have to rely on this neo-Ottoman Islamist idea that can be more simply about commercial trade.
Yeah, it is first and foremost about commercial trade. It's true, and in the mind of the politicians in Ankara, there's always this reflexive move that consists in trying to convert that kind of activity into political links. And those links usually rely on political Islam connections. So they go hand in hand. But you could also have a situation like the one you mentioned with Egypt, where Turkey is not someone that you can circumvent when you want to import goods, cheap goods. And as a result, you do end up with a big volume of activity, even though the political Islam current is almost non-existent in the case of Egypt.
Now turning to Libya, last week you told Ahval contributor Paul Idden that the result of the Berlin talks on Libya was essentially nothing. And indeed, renewed fighting starting Sunday ended a 2-week ceasefire, which wasn't really that effective at all. Forces of Haftar's Libyan National Army marched westwards from Sirte and clashed with GNA militias east of Misrata. What have you heard the latest from the front lines, and what might this new phase of the war look like?
Well, first of all, everything you've said is true, and I agree with it. But we're still at a level of intensity or a level of violence that is still lower than right before January 12th. January 12th, I would like to remind your listeners, is the date that was requested as the beginning of a truce from two presidents, Erdogan and Putin, and the request had been issued on January 8th out of Istanbul. So that level of intensity is still not back to what it used to be. And the reason is not because people are trying to be peaceful. The reason is the opposite. People are deeply intent on preparing for the next phase of the war, which, because Berlin was a failure, and I think it's important to acknowledge that it was a total failure. It wasn't okay. The next phase of the war is going to be much more intense than before January 12th. So we are basically gradually ramping up things. And today something happened which is significant. For the first time, a combat drone was flown by the UAE since this key date of January 12th. So this means that not only do you have Libyan actors like Marshal Haftar interested in attacking the other side, but he has wound up convincing the UAE to basically come back into the fold. And that's very, very worrisome. So it's all gradual. Nothing spectacular has happened, but every clue points to a very negative, destructive scenario, which is much worse than everything we have experienced over the last 10 months. This is very important.
Yeah, this morning, I think I saw your tweet in response to images of that LNA drone downed near Misrata. You said that Turkey's intervention from the start has meant to extend beyond Tripoli. And I may have misunderstood, please clarify for me, but your tweet also seemed to suggest that Turkey would be bringing in heavy artillery and that the UAE would need to follow suit. Is that correct?
No, it's the opposite. I was saying that the UAE, in order to prevail over whatever has been installed by Turkey in Tripolitania. And indeed, there has been rumors, which I think should be taken seriously.
Sorry, apologies. I just lost you for like 10 seconds. If you could just kind of go back a little.
Sorry. Okay, so what I meant by heavy artillery, I was talking about the UAE. The UAE has two options, or could actually implement a combination of the following two options. It could launch a shock and awe kind of assault from the air to overwhelm whatever Turkey has been able to install since December. It could also use heavy artillery, which hasn't really been used over the last 10 months. So this would be a way to kind of show Turkey that, yes, maybe Ankara has done its homework in terms of installing air defense systems, jamming systems, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, there's a desire to kill the Syrian mercenaries that were sent by Turkey. And one way of accomplishing this is by using assault tanks, for instance. You could also, as I said, witness a combination of those two. And that's the reason the current level of violence is still relatively mild, because there's an interest, which is ambiguous, right? And there's an interest on the part of Haftar to continue violating the ceasefire, but not in a big way, because there's still a lot of preparation that needs to be done. And you could say the opposite from a defensive perspective on the Turkish/GNA side, Government of National Accord in Tripoli. They are intent on remaining on the defensive mode, but they also need time because they haven't finished preparing everything that they would like to set up.
Last week, I described Libya's war as a cycle of escalation. Here's how I described it. Let me know if this is what you see as well. Because of their maritime borders deal, Turkey sees its Eastern Mediterranean energy hopes tied to the GNA, which has largely lost its European allies and thus must cling to Turkey's support in the face of the LNA assault. The UAE, meanwhile, has tied its regional strategy of countering Islamists to Haftar, who, in order to maintain the support of crucial factions, must always appear on the verge of winning the war. So Haftar must keep escalating and Turkey must keep responding to keep the GNA afloat. Is this an accurate depiction? And is this why you see the violence escalating in the days ahead?
Yeah, by and large, I do agree with the wide strokes, if you will. Of course, I would add nuances because, for instance, this idea that the UAE is in Libya only to crush political Islam is kind of misleading to say it this way, although it's accurate. The only way to crush political Islam is to crush any form of democratic opening. So this is not to say that the GNA is populated with angels and nice people, but what I'm saying is that they're not necessarily obsessed with liberal democracy, but it's a pluralistic arrangement, and the most virulent components of that coalition in Tripoli/Misrata are not necessarily proponents of political Islam, but the UAE and Egypt and many others are absolutely determined to expel them or just erase them from the face of the earth. That's not because they are obsessed with political Islam. That's not because they're obsessed with liberal democracy. It's simply because if you leave Tripoli alone, then you end up showing to the rest of the region that you could actually disagree with some other political factions and not end up killing each other. And that's exactly what the UAE doesn't want to be drawn as a conclusion in the region, because otherwise you'll have the wrong ideas sent to Tunisia, to Somalia, to Sudan, to Algeria, to Egypt, and then you'll be back with problems similar to 2011. So what I'm saying, the only way to sleep easy at night, if you're the UAE, is to institute and impose a very vertical form of tyranny, very much along the lines of what we have currently in Egypt. And so in Egypt, political Islam is very weak, and still repression continues. It's actually more intense than ever. Why? Because of the reason I just said. You have to make sure that every form of dissent, even if it has nothing to do with political Islam, is eliminated. And that's the only way to satisfy the very absolutist vision of the world that the UAE has. What I mean by the world is the Sunni Arab universe, obviously. Mm-hmm. And the other thing also is that what I like about your description is that you didn't highlight Russia too much. And then that's great, because there has been, over the last month or so, an exaggeration of Russia and what it can do in Libya. And that's because of the precedent that was Syria. A lot of people think that because they're lazy, because they don't understand Libya, because they don't respect the fact that Libya is very different from Syria, they kind of extrapolate. They look at Syria, which is much more vital for Moscow than Libya, they look at the full-blown military intervention that has been going on since September 2015, and they kind of assume that Russia, if it touches Libya, therefore it is almighty and will change the deal. It will basically alter the situation. That's not true. Russia is, first of all, not interested in doing this, and even if it were, right now, its options are limited. And the powerhouse that exists inside Libya right now, I'm sorry to repeat, is the UAE. And the UAE, unlike Iran or unlike the Assad regime, doesn't listen to Moscow. The UAE has many friends that have nothing to do with Russia. Of course, it would love to be friendly with Russia if it's possible, and that's still possible. But the UAE is its own man, and it has huge support from France and the EU in general.
Yeah, speaking of Russia, on Monday, while flying from Algeria to Gambia, Erdogan said that Russia had sent some 2,500 mercenaries from the Wagner group to fight with Haftar. He said that was one of the biggest mistakes in the war, but I read that it was only about 1,000 and that many of them have since pulled out.
They have never really pulled out. They just became less active, which is quite different. I would like to also add that there has been a lot of flights between Damascus or Syria in general and Benghazi in eastern Libya. That indicates, it doesn't prove anything, but it suggests that Wagner is not done. It might stage a comeback, especially within the context of a very intense, very large, ambitious new offensive, a brand new offensive using new techniques, new doctrines, and new ways of approaching the same Tripoli problem.
On Sunday, Erdogan said there's no military solution, and on Monday, as I just said, he described the Russian mercenaries as one of the biggest mistakes in the war. Yet this seems rather hypocritical since Turkey is sending some 6,000 Syrian rebels to fight for the GNA.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you cannot make a mistake with Wagner because Wagner doesn't exist in the official version of events according to Russia. So when Wagner fails, it by definition cannot be a mistake because you can always use the plausible deniability of it. So that's a beautiful feature that people should keep in mind. It doesn't commit the Russian state. The reason
I wonder if that's what Erdogan thinks of this using Syrian rebels, and maybe he got the idea from Putin.
No, unfortunately, Erdogan is caught, and that has a lot to do with domestic politics inside Turkey. We have to be very lucid about it. Turkey, in an ideal world, would have, because it is engaged in a logic that consists in announcing the military intervention in Libya in a very overt, official manner, which the UAE hasn't done, obviously, at all, then if you follow that logic and if you're consistent with yourself, then you should send 6,000 Turkish soldiers. Turkey cannot do that because Turkey is not a complete tyranny and Erdogan is not that almighty. If he sends the boys, the actual Turkish boys, and they die in Tripoli, it will create a huge backlash. And he doesn't enjoy unlimited power inside his country. At the end of the day, he's not the dictator or the complete dictator, if you will, that some people would like to make him out to be. So the reason he's using mercenaries is, first of all, because it fits his agenda in the Idlib area, but also because he has no choice. And it's interesting what he says about the Russian mercenaries. It's because Haftar has used thousands of Sudanese mercenaries and thousands of Russian mercenaries that Turkey knows that it can actually go ahead and send its own mercenaries because nobody can, attack it or criticize it for it, although people do for ideological reasons. And the 6,000, I say 6,000 because it's, I think, the objective that Turkey is probably going to attain very, very shortly, within a couple of weeks. I think that, as I said, it's the only tool that it has on the front line. It cannot afford to send Turkish citizens. And the other thing also is because you have the ability to do it since the other guys have done it for much longer. So I don't know if that answers your question.
You mentioned earlier that Turks are liked in Africa, or Turkey is liked in Africa. One of the reasons Erdogan has given for Turkey supporting the GNA is the sizable Turkish diaspora in Libya, mainly remnants of Ottoman rule. Personally, I did not know until quite recently that Libyan Turks make up 20% or 25%, nearly a quarter of the country's population. Please, if you could, give us some idea of how these Turkish origin citizens are seen by the mainly Arab population. Are they seen as outsiders? I ask in part because in Turkey, even Arabs who've lived there for years, who've become citizens, lived there even generations, are seen as outsiders.
Well, first of all, that figure is not correct. You don't have 25% of Libyans that are of Turkish origin. You do have that phenomenon. You have a tribe in Zawiya. Zawiya is located 45 kilometers to the west of Tripoli on the coast. You do have a tribe there that has links, ancestral links to the Turkish nation. You have obviously the same phenomenon in Misrata, but by and large, this is not a pure line, and it's very often exaggerated. And it's exaggerated, unfortunately, by both.
If I might ask, what's the accurate percentage of the population, do you think?
Or I would know, but it's certainly not that order of magnitude for sure.
Okay.
What's unfortunate, very, very sad right now, is the fact that Erdogan is issuing those kinds of reckless, irresponsible statistics. It only contributes to ethnic polarization inside Libya. Libya has enough intra-Libyan hatred problems. And the other thing also is that the same argument is being used by the LNA side. If you remember, one way of insulting the Minister of the Interior and even the Prime Minister, just 3 weeks ago, the spokesperson for the Libyan National Army of Haftar, instead of calling them dogs, he called them Turks. So that gives you an idea of how bad the situation is in terms of polarized discourse and hatred, just pure hatred. So this is really not helpful, especially when both sides go at it.
Do we have any? There's been some disagreement about the extent to which these Libyan Turks support the Turkish intervention. Do we have any idea whether the majority of them side with the GNA and agree with Turkey's military backing?
Well, first of all, this Turkish past, if you will, is much deeper in Western Libya than Eastern Libya. And as you know, the Haftar side is mostly, not entirely, mostly based in Eastern Libya. So just because of that asymmetry, it's easy to demonize the Turkish past of Tripolitania. Because Tripolitania is bigger, it was always more important from a commercial perspective, it mattered to the Ottomans much more, and so on and so forth. So you have this structural asymmetry, which you can always exploit in a very dishonest fashion when you're into politics and civil war rhetoric. To answer your question, I know a lot of Libyans of Turkish origin that are deeply ashamed of the fact that the only nation interested in defending the internationally recognized government right now in Tripoli happens to be Turkey, because Turkey is known as a bully around Cyprus in the waters because of that natural gas that has been discovered over the last 6 to 7 years. It has done reprehensible things in northern Syria over the last several months. It's much less democratic now than 10 years ago. You have all kinds of reasons that explain the fact that whether you're Arab or a Turk or an Amazigh, you're going to have a lot of problems with this situation. And of course, the cherry on the pie is those Syrian mercenaries. This is seen as a catastrophe by a lot of pro-GNA people. Unfortunately, they have had no choice in the matter.
Why a catastrophe? They feel they're just being used?
Because it's the argument that happened to be false, that was completely and constantly used by the Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and of course the Haftar people. They were basically accusing them of bringing in radical or battle-hardened Islamists from Syria. That accusation has been around for more than a year. And here we are basically giving them a beautiful gift by doing exactly what they were blaming the GNA for doing, falsely. Now it's true. So this is very, very bad news, because if you look at what is happening right now inside the EU, you have a block of states that are absolutely happy to see the destruction that I was alluding to as a possible next development in the Tripoli area because of the Syrian mercenaries, right? Countries like, I'm talking about beyond France. France and the UAE, there's no deep daylight between the two. They're like, Tweedledee and Tweedledum. They're absolutely inseparable. But I'm talking beyond France. Even, I would say, even Germany to some extent. And obviously, states like Cyprus and Greece, those countries don't really understand Libya. They've seen war for the last 9 to 10 months with no side effects really reaching their shores or creating any kind of disruption in terms of their own national security. Now you add the Syrian mercenaries, which look really, really ugly to them, then you're done. You're done convincing almost the entire EU bloc. And that's a catastrophe, because what we are going to see over the next several weeks is a much higher level of destruction in Tripoli, and the EU will stay pat. One crucial step, there are other reasons, but one crucial step was this horrible image that has been projected by Turkey by sending Syrian mercenaries.
Yeah, speaking of this, on Monday, the GNA accused Haftar of launching missile attacks at civilian targets and said it might not participate in the future ceasefire talks. Apparently, they were presumably referring to the 5+5 committee talks coming up in Geneva. I wonder, after the failure in Berlin, do you hold out much hope that the West, that Europe and maybe the United States might be able to help the two sides find some common ground, or is it all up to Turkey, the UAE, and maybe Russia?
More the latter. I don't really see any effort that is both genuine and forceful in terms of diplomatic push emanating from any Western nation. The US has clearly shown that it doesn't care one way or another. Russia is limited, very limited, as I said to you earlier, and the EU is completely caught in a very binary, simplistic, and mostly false depiction of what is about to happen in western Libya over the next several weeks. So if Egypt can talk to Turkey directly, and hopefully there are some efforts like this, and if the Libyans can avoid having a completely bogus 5.5 military commission happen in Geneva, make it happen and make it meaningful, if they could do that, maybe that will offer a small chance of avoiding the worst.
Haftar shut several key ports a couple of weeks ago, reportedly cutting oil exports from some 1.2 million barrels per day to about 70,000, 72,000. The GNA says this could crush its government and cripple the economy. Is that true? And what's the impact been so far?
Unfortunately, it's not true. I wish it were true. Because the one very key feature of the central bank in Tripoli is that it sits on dozens and dozens of billions of dollars in terms of foreign exchange reserves, which means that you cannot strangle the economy. I'm not saying it has no consequences. Consequences will be felt over time, and they're very nasty. But within, let's say, a time frame of just several weeks, you could actually make countries like Italy feel a very acute pain and get it in line, because Italy is still trying to somehow stay in a grayish area as opposed to just giving its unconditional support to Haftar like France has done. You can achieve a lot through the blockade. And the reason I find it absolutely disgraceful and catastrophic is because I saw that the only country that has a tradition of preventing those oil blockades, I'm talking about the United States of America, what we saw on the 19th of January in Berlin was a Secretary of State that couldn't be bothered. He could have said something, he didn't. He could have condemned
right, Haftar had done it just a couple days before the Berlin talk.
Yeah, exactly. So he had the information. And just in June 2018, the US, we had this similar situation, a blockade that involved 500 or 600,000 barrels a day for a couple of weeks. It was clearly initiated by Haftar. It wasn't even controversial. Everybody knew it at the time. And the entity that kind of compelled Haftar to reopen the faucet was the United States, not the EU, not the UN, not anybody else. It was the United States of Donald Trump. So that is the proof that they could actually prevent this kind of blockade. But this time around, because of all kinds of factors, including huge supply on the international oil markets, they have decided to not care. And that's disastrous.
Last question for you. You said that you expect a significant escalation of violence in the coming days. I wonder if you could describe that a little bit. What's the extent of the devastation we might expect or the displacement?
I think there was hope, mainly on the part of President Erdogan initially, that he basically studied the situation. His people studied the situation in Tripoli for the last several months. They've had plenty of time. And they kind of decided that the main problem was the airstrikes, because the big source of strength on the side of Haftar is not Libyan, it's Emirati. And I'm talking about a fleet of combat drones and periodically actual fighter jets that have been bombing the Tripoli area. So he decided that it was the main issue. And accordingly, he decided to send air defense systems and jamming systems like we discussed earlier. And that, I think, followed the logic whereby the hope would have been, okay, this should balance things out. We kind of know the lay of the ground, the lay of the land. This is the situation. I'm going to add one component and hopefully things will cool off. So I will guarantee the survival of the government that I like, and the level of intensity will come down, and the EU will hear a reasonable voice in terms of avoiding the worst, and things will kind of settle down a little bit. It will be ugly, but it will be a step forward in terms of Turkish interests. And I think that was the rationale. And I believe that the rationale is completely off. This is not to say that Turkey will fail. That's not what I'm saying. I think we cannot predict things. I don't underestimate Turkey. I think it's taking all of this very seriously. It's putting a lot of means on the table, and it might pull off a surprise or two. However, one thing that we've learned this month, I'm not talking about November or December, what we have seen in January is unconditional, brazen support from on the part of France for whatever the UAE chooses to do, regardless of the level of destruction. What I'm saying is that there's now a priority in Abu Dhabi, which consists in showing to the entire world that Erdogan was wrong to go into Tripolitania like he has done over the last month or two. Which the only way to do that is by, as I said earlier, launching a shock and awe kind of campaign from the air and from the ground, involving a humongous amount of weaponry and potentially foreign mercenaries all at once to overwhelm the Turks. And that involves a huge level of destruction, many deaths, including civilian deaths, and Libyans are completely in the status of collateral damage. Nobody pays attention to what they think anymore. And this is absolutely bad. And I consider that the Europeans, and specifically France, will be responsible when this happens. Of course, they will still not care, because Daesh is relatively weak in Libya. The migrant flow into Sicily is almost zero, and there's no expectation for it to explode to the upside. And the oil blockade doesn't mean that the West has lost control over oil production in Libya. They could, it's Haftar who blocked it. So if they decide to strike a deal and resume flow, oil would not be a problem. So oil is not a problem, terrorism is not a problem, migrants are not a problem. This means that if the huge level of destruction that I fear in the Tripoli area and probably also in Misrata actually happens, the EU is not going to see it as a problem. And that to me is very, very sad.
It sounds like you say the main problem is that the UAE has taken this personally, beating Erdogan.
Well, they can, therefore they do. They have all the leeway. Everybody is absolutely obsessed with preserving their friendship with the UAE. And the UAE is demanding in exchange the ability to do whatever it wants in Libya, and it's obtaining that ability. It's getting that privilege.
Jalel Harchaoui from the Clingendael Institute. Thank you so much for your time and insight. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.